Welcome to the very first episode of La Crème de la Crème, where we dive into the minds of the brightest and the most inspiring professional in the tech industry.
And that way I joined this Springford.net team. It was my dream job back then. And that was the initial idea of this dependency inversion.
Today, I'm thrilled to introduce you to an exceptional software architect who has not only shaped the world of software engineering, but also witnessed the evolution of the Spring framework from its humble beginnings.
I thought, oh my God, this is so old. I thought they teach this in kindergarten these days. Or getting something to work wasn't exactly what intrigued me anymore. It was more about how can I write it better? I think the most important thing is actually curiosity. So something that drives you.
Get ready for an insightful conversation filled of valuable advices, captivating stories, and even few laughs as we uncover the secrets of a successful career in software engineering. You're gonna love this question.
Okay, hit me. You promised I'm going to love this question.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to get the latest updates of La Crème de la Crème. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride as we unveil the story of a true software engineering genius. With no further ado, I'm gonna leave you to it. Thank you so much for joining this interview. Well, it's not a tech interview, but we want to grab some information from you. And yeah, so maybe we can start by, can you introduce yourself for the viewers and tell us briefly about your career?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. My name's Erich Eichinger. I'm in the industry already for almost 30 years, I would say. When I started programming when I was 13 and I got my first computer, I got extremely excited. Well, nowadays it's already considered old, I suppose. It's like I already interviewed candidates which claimed that I only started programming when I was already 10. Was like, okay, good. I was already 13 when I started, ever since I got good questions about what I did over my career. First, I started doing some hobby side projects besides university, and I always got fascinated and enthusiastic about programming. And I remember before I got my first computer, I was reading the instruction. It was a Amstrad CPC 464, and they had this manual, the printed manual with the basic language, and I was reading the language in my bed all night. Before I even had the computer, and but I didn't start. I originally went into physics, and because I didn't want to make. I knew once I start going into computer science, I would lose all interest in anything else. my life would become very single-sided. But eventually I decided physics is a little bit hard. I actually have to learn something, and computers always seem easy and more interesting and intriguing to me. So eventually I settled for studying computer science. Through that I also got my first jobs. I think my first job was in 1995, I believe, or 6, where I got my first salary. And
I was even 8 years old.
Well, I was already 23 by that time. And it was quite exciting to work with real software engineers, and I never worked with professional software engineers before. And as well, I also made my first experience that you can have the most genius ideas if you don't regularly check in with your product owners and make sure that what you're doing is what they want. then the project just goes astray, and that's pretty much what happened in my first own project that I got. It was at Alcatel back in the time, and then I got eventually, after some additional smaller jobs, where I actually I experienced pretty much everything from I started working at a company that wanted me to fix their or maintain their Windows NT network. I had absolutely no idea of networks. I thought, okay, I can just figure it out as I go along. And I think a month later, I left with a lot of experience in networking, but them having a network that didn't work anymore. I did something, I have no idea what I did, but the entire network didn't work, and I worked all night and I couldn't get it back to work anymore, so they let me go. But eventually then I ended up in my a long-term job where I started at Viennese web consulting company that started out as a small shop, but we had a genius CEO. He was really good at acquiring projects, acquiring customers, interesting projects, interesting customers. And I think within 3 years we became the market leader in Austria. And that's where we started with a small company with only, I think, 10 employees or so, developing all kinds of web projects. So initially it was just the image websites, but it quickly developed into more elaborate, let's say, customer self-service websites, for instance, where we suddenly had to integrate with all kinds of backend systems like SAP, Siebel, Oracle, and whatnot. We got in all kinds of different industries, and we also started offering hosting those sites for our customers. So in the end, I was involved in pretty much everything from the first pre-sales, basically talks with customers, what problems they have, what we could do for them, and over architecting the project or designing the project, and then also talking to we back then already had what you can now call user experience designers that cared about the user flow and the website, etc. And we by implementation of the stuff over to hosting and running it on our own racks in our own in our company. So from the bare metal, maintaining the operating systems on top of that, maintaining the software and keep it running. All the software projects that we developed, we were responsible to keep them running ourselves. So this is where you end up basically doing everything, where you also have to learn everything. And most importantly, in my opinion, is I learned most because you have to eat your own dog food. You are suffering from the mistakes you're doing. And sometimes there's even a year in between where you develop the stuff, you deployed it, you're running it, everything goes well, and then something goes wrong, and you have to figure it out. And this is where you learn suddenly how what things are good or unnecessary, because one day you will need them. And also, essentially, we came up with, or we used some sort of agile delivery or incremental delivery before it even had a name, because we had to. Customers had change requests. They wanted changes. We needed to be we needed to come up with automating the delivery pipelines. We wrote some code. We want to deploy it. Of course, it was all very, let's say, in German the term is hemdsärmelig. I'm just wondering the corresponding English term, but eventually we had to do all those things, because otherwise we had gone out of business.
All right. So also I checked your LinkedIn profile, which is impressive, And I also saw that you were working for Pivotal, the company that created Spring Boot.
Yeah, yeah.
Or the Spring Framework.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Well, not the whole experience, but how it was.
Well, ultimately, it was also an interesting learning. The way I got there actually was that for this Viennese company I worked with, we worked back then in parallel on two platforms, .NET and Java. Mostly in the beginning with Java because we thought it's a cool technology, and then later, and at that time I was already sort of the head of the development department, mostly because I was coding the most. But eventually I decided that if we wanted to deliver fast, back then it was sort of Java, enterprise Java beans, and it was extremely heavyweight. That was even before the Spring invention, and when Microsoft came out with .NET, and it turned out that with .NET, or even worse, I don't even dare to say, but the first project we delivered was even in Visual Basic. Was in VB6, but it turned out to be extremely successful. It was under the hood. If you looked under the rug, it looked horrible. So that the project was really hard to maintain everything, but it was scribbled together in 2 weeks to solve a particular problem of entering data for a website, and eventually we were able to use it for. I don't know, myriads of projects. It was extremely successful. It allowed us to do all kinds of things. So there's also another learning that I had was it doesn't have to be pretty, and sometimes you have to take back your engineering pride because commercially it just works. But eventually we will replace it, and then later, or actually my successor replaced it, and later. But so anyway, we worked on. We started delivering projects on .NET because the cycle time to get something out and deployed was much shorter and quicker with .NET than it was with Java. And one of the things that I discovered along that way was that there was a friend of mine, as a later friend, back then I didn't know him, but a small team of enthusiasts that ported the Spring framework back then on the .NET platform. It was called Spring Framework.net. And I started using that in our projects at the company. But the problem is I discovered a lot of bugs along the way. So in the Spring.net framework, and so I had to fix a lot of bugs because we had this stuff in production. I couldn't just leave it, and because they were just did it as a side project, as a hobby project, so they couldn't keep up with my number of pull requests that I sent them, and eventually they because by the time I already had maintained our own branch of the framework. And this is where I learned also, you don't do that. You never do this because it's a nightmare when you have to constantly merge your own changes with the upstream changes from the framework maintainers. But eventually they gave me commit rights. I still kept this email. There's something, I think it's easier for all of us if we give you commit rights. And that way I joined this Spring.net team. In the beginning, still as a member of my company in Austria, and so I became a maintainer. And eventually, then I joined the Spring Source. I'm not sure if they were already called Spring Source or still Interface 21 by the time. I think they were already called Spring Source. And then I remember I went to Antwerp for a Spring One conference. Where I talked to Jürgen Höller. He's a fellow Austrian, and we immediately got along quite well. So I asked him if he would be interested in hiring me, and then it took a while because I think by the time they were already in talks with VMware, about the sale. So I was only a small fish in the pond to take care about. So, but I had some talks with Jürgen Höller, with Adrian Collier, and also with Rod Johnson, the founders and CTOs of SpringSource back then. And that's how I eventually joined SpringSource as a contractor for billing reasons. Sadly, though, that was shortly before the VMware sale went off, and I remember it was one of the saddest days that I remember was sitting there. I think it was on the 6th of January, because I remember it was a holiday, and suddenly the emails coming in on the mailing list, on the internal mailing list, of people saying goodbye because they got laid off. And I think back then, at that time, on that day, SpringSource laid off a third of their engineering staff or something. And of course, because I was one of the last ones to join, I was one of the first ones to be let go. So I remember my lead calling me and telling me the news, asking me if he could do anything. I said, yeah, well, what can you do? There's nothing you can do about. So I just have to live with the fact. Yeah. It's sad. It was my dream job back then. Mm-hmm. But I
think you already realized your dream. Joining the SpringSource.
Ultimately, SpringSource was, of course, at that time, peak career, and we also had. I attended a couple of their on-site meetings that they organized. Because SpringSource back then, always was, I think, in a remote-first company, or very soon became a remote-first company, before anyone else was a remote-first company. And
it was successful back at that time.
It was, well, we all know Framework is extremely successful. Yeah. Of course, that Jürgen Höller and Rod Johnson, they're outstanding people. They're just, I don't know, not from this world. Actually, Rod Johnson is a fantastic concert pianist. Mm-hmm. So he studied music. So he did. Programming is his hobby, and Spring Framework, and he developed with Jürgen together, and then Rod successfully managed and built up this company until the sale to VMware. Yeah. So he's an incredible person.
Yeah, and out of a hobby, they built one of the most famous frameworks.
Hobby. He
it
got, to put it polite, annoyed by what the reason that drove me to the .NET world was because Java was just unusable by that time with enterprise Java beans, etc. That was just so complex that in the beginning I was super intrigued. I was fascinated by the ideas and the concept. But when you try to put this into practice and deliver something with it, you realize it's a nightmare. Okay. And it took you ages to just get small things done. One of the things is that you had to deploy the application into an application server that cost a fortune as well, like JBoss Enterprise, or I don't know how they were called, all the packages, and before you could even see anything, and each deployment took 5 to 10 minutes. So if you make a change and you couldn't see the change, you couldn't unit test it locally because you had all this enterprise Java bean stuff in your application. So it was heavily dependent on application server functionality. And these were all these reasons where Rod began, and then later Jürgen joined him in his efforts to come up with a framework that allowed you to develop Java applications without this heavyweight application server stuff. So again, that's where the term Pojo came from. Then plain old Java object. We want to write just Java classes to do our test, to do our business logic in the testing. Like, why should this depend on? And that was the idea of this, the initial idea of this dependency inversion. To get rid of these application server dependencies. Your business logic should never depend on the application server you're deploying it into. So that was the roots of the Spring framework.
Yeah, actually, it's really impressive knowing the history. So, like personally, I'm too much into Java and Spring framework, and I didn't know exactly the history, like where these things came from, and it's really informative to know from where the idea of the Spring framework came. So yeah, it's really nice.
Yeah, I must admit, this is when I look around. I've already considered doing some sort of talk series or so about what the elders knew, because I see a lot of knowledge being lost. And I got just our colleague today, when he told us about there was a talk about the golf patterns, the Gang of Four patterns. Mm-hmm. I thought, oh my God, this is so old. I thought they teach this in kindergarten these days, but probably not.
Absolutely. So that was really informative and impressive knowing about all of this. The next question is, could you walk us a bit through the path of becoming a senior software engineer / architect? Maybe we can, like, you can choose if you want to focus on software engineering or like even becoming an architect.
Ever since you sent me the questions ahead of the interview, I was thinking about this question, how to answer it, because the honest answer, the truth is, I never followed the plan. Mm-hmm. So it's not that I had a strategic approach to developing my career. I always followed my interests to a degree, and they were at least twofold. I mean, all the other interests, but one was because I developed software already by the time for quite a while. So writing code itself was not, or getting something to work wasn't exactly what intrigued me anymore. It was more about, so how can I write it better? And also my experiences from all this operating the stuff that I wrote myself, and also falling into a lot of traps, like not checking user input. I remember a whole bunch of nights that I spent looking for random stalls of our website, simply because I did not bother checking, for instance, the image size of that editors uploaded into the website, and we never scaled them down, and we just rendered them as is to customers live from the database without any caching, whatever. I mean, complete madness from today's perspective. But back then we had to deliver quickly, and we didn't think of it. But whenever a user opened this particular page that contained this particular image, it's just it took I don't know, half a minute or even a minute to download that image. People got impatient, hit a couple of times refresh, and suddenly our worker threads were gone on the web server, and the website didn't work anymore. And of course this happened completely randomly, and then we had to investigate, we had to diagnose all this. So this is where I learned how important it is to include logging and all this diagnostics information, and also to follow this eternal rule of never trust user input wherever it's coming from, and also consider look at a function and think about what are the failure modes of this. So how many ways can you think of how this goes wrong? Yeah. Which is also drew back the connection to university. I remember I did a they call it Pro Lab in Prolog, the language. I remember we had in our practices when we wrote code, we always had to come up with tests, and the rule was we had to come up with one positive test and at least 3 negative tests. Yeah. I hated our professor back then, but then and nowadays I know that's the right approach. That's super important to think about what can go wrong. which
because the happy path is still a happy path, but you need to cover the unhappy paths.
And that's where, from my experience, I probably can think of a lot more failure modes than others these days. But so that's where I kept always in the back of my head to circle back to where we're coming from, how to become an architect. I think it was more taking responsibility for the stuff that you're doing. What they now call you build it, you run it. That was for me kind of normal. That was the basic at all. Also, I admit what really annoys me these days when I see engineers always blaming everyone or everything else. Or because I don't know how many engineers I met in my life who said, "Oh, the spring framework is shit. This is it doesn't work." And then because have you ever read the documentation about it? And then you fix it. Well, the problem is not the framework. The problem is a layer 8 problem. Yeah. It's sitting in front of the computer, of the keyboard. So that's where and my first reaction usually to a problem was is it my fault? Was it my fault? This is something I did. And only once I was really sure that it wasn't my fault, then I started exploring other potential problems, because most of the time it is simply a programming mistake or something, some oversight, whatever. You missed a potential combination of input parameters, whatever. Yeah. And that's also where you come up with testing strategies. You become interested in test automation. And once you have been through test automation, you end up, for instance, with more the softer parts, where you realize that a lot of problems is also of misunderstood requirements or unexplored requirements. Yeah. That's where you end up with ideas like behavior-driven development, which still to this day a lot of people just think of or take a very functional approach to it, rather than treating it what it was meant to be, rather triggering a discussion about what different scenarios could there be, and how do you even recognize when you're done. This is one thing that I miss still to this day in almost every story I see, is that people don't think about that. There's this saying, I think with the start with the end in mind. And I think that also applies to a story. When you start implementing a feature, you think you should think about how do I recognize when I'm done with this feature, and that's your acceptance criteria. Write them down, discuss them with the business folks. Don't make any assumptions, because as a software engineer, you're the worst person to make any assumptions about the business. And it's all these things that you learn as you go along, and think about, so how can I write better and deliver better software that makes users and generally stakeholders happier. And then you become an architect, where you realize, okay, it also becomes important to understand the entire business context. So think about the business context, where you I just read finally got around to read the Software Architect Elevator by Gregor Hoppe, who phrased it as that the architects live in a first derivative. So where you're not interested in what is the structure. And I see a lot of architecture diagrams who just depict some sort of static structure and dependencies between modules. That's not the important part. The important part is the dynamics. So how do parts interact? And that's one. And much more important, how is the world around going to develop and to evolve? I also once heard, there's also these things that get stuck in my mind and were driving my thinking, was is when you when you can build or assume you build the perfect software. You have the perfect requirements, you got the perfect software, even then it will go out of fashion eventually because the world around evolves. So eventually it will not be perfect anymore. So, and that's why you as an architect just need to, or actually as an engineer, you start thinking about, okay, which parts of the application are going to evolve how. And then you also know, or you see that you have only a limited set of resources like time, money, etc. So you need to start thinking about where to invest your time. And some parts of the application, they probably they work. They don't have to. They don't have to be perfect, but they're not gonna change that much anymore. But there are other parts who gonna change rather more often, and this is where you wanna apply more of your efforts in making it really clean, well tested, etc. And that's, in my opinion at least, when you start thinking like that, when you start thinking how are things going to evolve, that's where you become an architect. So it's I don't think you can say I become an architect and I read those books and then I'm an architect. I think it's also a mindset.
Since we were talking about skills, so can you tell us what key skills you believe are essential for someone looking to get into software engineering?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is actually curiosity, so something that drives you. Because also let's rephrase that, is I also had a lot of people approaching my life asking, so how much can you earn in software development? And I keep why does it matter? Because when you consider you're doing this for 40, 50 years in your life, money will only take you so far. Yeah. But once you are over a certain age, I'm probably above that, and so I know what I'm talking about. Money doesn't drive you anymore, and you have to have something else that drives you, and that's some passion, some curiosity, that gets you out of bed in the morning trying to figure something out. And also when software programming can be extremely tedious because you have to framework documentation. It doesn't tell you everything. So there's always some information missing that you need to figure out, that you need to find out. So you need to get it elsewhere. You need to find it either from the internet these days, on Stack Overflow. Luckily, you find a lot of solutions there, or you do it with trial and error, where you're trying to figure out how these things work and how things work together. And with frameworks, it gets even worse because sometimes they're just missing the information, so what they're expecting from you, or you don't see under the hoods how things are connected. And you suddenly realize, okay, when I'm doing that, something else goes wrong. And you don't know why. You have no idea how these things are connected. So these are things where you need the curiosity to keep you going. And the second thing is stamina to overcome these periods of frustration, because it will be frustrating when you're sitting for hours. Actually, I had my case yesterday myself when I tried to get something to work, and I had to trial and error lots of things until I finally found the right combination of parameters or parameter values. So yeah, I'd say curiosity, stamina is something that you definitely need in order to make a career in software development and stay in software development.
So, like to resume, passion and curiosity are the key to really get into, and not really just getting into, but continuing on this software engineering path.
To continue on this software engineering path, and most importantly also to get better.
Yeah.
And this intrinsic motivation to understand what you're doing, to understand what's going on. you don't want to be a developer who is working with a framework for 10 years and still has no clue how it's working. Yeah, it's not helping anybody. First of all, it's not interesting to you. It will not motivate you for the rest of your life, and your work life can take until 70 or 75 if they keep increasing the pension age. So you need to find something else, and then that also means that you need to better understand and get to the bottom of things, discover principles, understand them, and that's also where things, by the way, get interesting again, because you start discovering patterns where you realize, okay, this is the same how this works, and so where you suddenly can fit two things together where you first didn't even see a connection.
Okay, so talking about passion and the skills, like, did you face any challenges during your career? If yes, how did you overcome them? Like, not even, we don't need to be that specific, but generally speaking, like,
how much time do you have? Well, there's a lot of obstacles, I would say. And I think the question is, how do you overcome them, and do you grow from them? Mm-hmm. I know people might start smiling at it when I say I'm actually an introvert. I didn't like talking in front of people or putting myself in the middle, and I like to retreat into my cave. So it was one of the things that I had to overcome, for instance, in order, because software in development ultimately, this is something I had to learn, is an extremely collaborative profession. Because as a lonely wolf, there's this typical phrase that if you want to go fast, you have to go alone. If you want to go far, you have to go together in a group. And I also had, one of the experiences that I made was I went fast, and then I realized that a lot of things that I developed, that I coded, always, when there were any things to change or problems or whatever, they always ended up on my desk again. And I suddenly couldn't breathe anymore, because I was flooded with work. That I actually caused myself, because nobody else understood it. I didn't pair with anyone, and nobody else understood what I had done. Although it might have been, I still think some of the things were genius. Maybe some, in retrospect, were probably less genius. But that's where I learned to also hold myself back, and it was actually a hard lesson to get. I would even call this a burnout that I ran into, where I didn't have any energy anymore, but that's where I had to learn the hard way to delegate things, and also to work together with other people, to avoid being the bottleneck, and that's definitely what I became back then, or what I was back then.
This is actually drives us to the next question, which is like, can you maybe share some advices how to balance technical knowledge and soft skills in software industry? I think this is so much important.
It is hugely important. It's just difficult to answer, because now that I've reached an age and a seniority where there are people looking up to me for advice, like your question just indicates. And I mean, I do have my knowledge, because I did spend a lot of time doing software, developing software, and having this passion about it, and or maybe it was probably even borderline obsessive, I would say. But of course, on the other hand, that's all the knowledge. That's where I gained all my knowledge from. On the other hand, I even had 2 or 3 years in my life where I didn't take a single day of vacation. and I didn't even notice because I was working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. So I can't recommend doing that. There's certainly better ways of doing that, and it's to me now the knowledge is to be more collaborative and open to engage with the communities. One of the reasons why I'm sitting here now is because I discovered how important that is, how you can learn things without bleeding yourself by I don't know, banging your head for 3 nights in a row against the same problem. Just talk to someone and get a second or third pair of eyes on the problem, and you might realize suddenly the problem is much quicker and solved. Or even just there's this story about from the pragmatic program about duck talking. To just step away from the problem, go out with friends, and also one thing that helped me oddly enough is or not oddly enough, it's having a family. After I got married and had kids, your priorities shift automatically. So you realize that a lot of things in software development are not that important, which before you thought are the most important thing in the world. Then you realize, okay, so we need to balance more, or find other people who probably might have fun solving the problem. So there's multiple ways of doing it, but as you said, yes, balancing it is important. Especially, my recommendation would be to find a hobby that is my hobby is, for instance, outdoors, going hiking, especially with my kids, my wife, taking them somewhere, hiking up the mountain, going skiing, going swimming somewhere, whatever, because that definitely takes your mind off, and that's, I think, extremely important these days. And this is something I was certainly missing for 15 years of my life, because my brain never switched off, and that is very unhealthy.
Yeah, I guess this would be the best advice ever to anyone who wants to get into the industry.
Yeah.
Balancing
So
life.
if you realize that you have this passion and borderline obsession, then I highly recommend to quickly look for a hobby that does not involve sitting somewhere. That makes you physically active.
So, after talking about how you can balance your life and also like the importance of technical skills and soft skills and even life balance for a software engineer, can you maybe briefly tell us what are the steps can someone take to advance from junior software engineer to a senior software engineer?
Let's say the best people I've met in my life, they took initiative. I think that's where, especially that's where what I look out for is not for people who are just doing what they're told, but for people who have an opinion. Say, okay, I think this is right and we should be doing that, and they stick to that, or they bring up that opinion, and they also are able to take initiative in order to do that. So that's and this is something where I think as a senior is important, because this is also, I mean, one begets the other, I would say. So when you are interested in how to make things better, how to improve, and you also start involving others and discussing with others, that's where you're developing also some sort of leadership skills. And this is when you become and this will turn you into a senior, I would say. I mean, there's a lot of other things like I mean, when you just Google a little bit, you will find a lot of books. This, by the way, reminds me, I also wanted to assemble a list of books that I found particularly interesting, or that had an impact on me, that stuck in my head, and changed the direction of my thinking to a degree, or inspired me. And I think this is also important. I love books. My house is full of books. Also, my parents' house was full of books, so probably that's where I got it from. I'm always getting suspicious when people tell me, "Oh, I never read books." I don't think that you can learn everything just by watching a video, or just reading blog posts. Yeah. I think it's also important to read books that put things in a context, and that have a wider horizon, that are connecting things. And there are a few books that are extremely valuable in this regard. Of course, there's a lot of books that are also just rubbish, but. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks. That was really informative again. So the next question is, what are the most important qualities that a software engineer should have to be successful in their careers?
Well, to a degree, we already had that. So I think it's curiosity, stamina, and ultimately, once you develop an opinion, you develop experience, then I think it's also important that you start, or to me at least, it was the most valuable step in that direction, or to develop myself, was also to get out of my introversity, is to start teaching. Okay. Because this is where you're forced to explain things, to order your thoughts, which is also, when you're writing blog posts, for instance, also extremely helpful. I'm not very successful at writing blog posts, mostly because of the time it involves. But I like to do trainings where I'm explaining things to people who, or to newbies, to people who don't know the technology or the topic as much as I do. So I think that because then you always get questions that you never thought of, for instance, or you would have never thought of, and you're forced to explain that. And so this is one of the, and the other thing, important thing or step that you need to take, I think, in the long run, is, as an engineer, I see a lot of engineers who completely disregard the business. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that's why we're here for. IT is not a, I mean, hopefully in the past 20 years, we've overcome this idea of IT being a cost center. Mm-hmm. But it needs to be a hand in hand with the business, that software enables business. And so that you also need to develop some sort of economic perspective, economic thinking of the impact that software has, and how it helps the company to grow, for instance.
I guess you're gonna love this question.
Okay, hit me.
Okay, so how do you stay up to date with new technologies and developments in the industry?
You said you promised I'm going to love this question. It's we all know it's difficult because it's a evolving field. It's and ultimately you can't stay up to date with all technologies. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you need to. My way is read a lot, watch a lot of talks at conferences, for instance, but also and most importantly, actually have a community. Either in our office here with the tech community of practice, but also in larger communities. And ultimately, I also think that what you're doing with your YouTube channel, for instance, is awesome, because that's where eventually people will start telling you their problems or their experiences, and so you can stop bleeding yourself or banging your own head against the wall, and just benefit from other people sharing their experiences with you. So that's it can happen in several ways. So that's why how I try to stay up to date. It's you always have the feeling that it's not enough, that you're not staying up to date enough, and this is also something you have to accept eventually, because the number of my interests just in software development alone is still a lot bigger and larger than I could ever manage time-wise, not to mention having a family and being part of my local community in the village.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, so this is the final question and then we'll be done. So what advice do you have for aspiring software engineers on how to be successful in their careers? Well, I think we already mentioned a lot of advices, but like if we can
have fun, I would say. And ultimately, you only stick to things when you're enjoying them. So you need to find find a way to make it fun. Even if maybe if you're not having fun, that might work for a certain period. And let's face it, not everything is fun. But I mean, there's even the field of software engineering is so huge. It's from working with customer relationship management systems to IoT, to doing data engineering, data analytics, artificial intelligence. There are so many different fields, or also domains actually, where software engineering is used, from aviation to online betting. That in each of those domains have their own challenges. So if you have any let's say fable for programming and software engineering in general, then I'm pretty sure you will be able to find a domain. And actually, something that we haven't mentioned yet, and something that I would have liked to have, but never really found, or only later found when I joined SpringSource, is some sort of mentor. And I think this helps a lot in being successful, having some wise old guy to occasionally ask for advice. I think that's a good last statement.
Yeah. Actually,
white-haired.
Yeah, but this is like the sign of real experience, and like.
Oh yes, this is a sign of a lot of grief and and banging my head against many walls. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think this is what drove you to who you are today, I guess.
The banging.
Yeah, I'm talking from career.
No, it's a joy. It's the and ultimately this is also why I like to a degree the life as consultant, because the life as consultant has the advantage that you are seeing a lot of different ways of working, how people work. It gives you the opportunity to find within shorter periods of time what's working, what isn't, rather than we're staying with the company with the same company for 15 or 20 years. So you get a really broad horizon when you work as a consultant. The downside is you, as a consultant, there's always a little bit the expectations at clients that you know everything. And a boss of mine previously famously stated, actually you don't have to know everything, and you don't have to be smart as the client. You just need to be fast at Googling. And ultimately, this is, to a degree, this is true, because I mean, I get through my experience, I get quite quick at knowing what I'm looking for, and that's also a difference. And through this, because you're seeing in different domains, different people work, different organizations, different ways of working, where you can you get a good sense of what works, what doesn't, and what counts, what doesn't.
Yeah. Right. Thank you so much for your time. It was
a pleasure.
Such an impressive interview, and I'm really honored to have this interview with you. I think we had a lot of information. Yeah, a lot of information, a lot of advices, and especially a lot of history, especially about spring lovers. So I think I'm sure they will love and enjoy this video. So thank you so much again, and I hope to have another podcast or another interview together about some other topics.
Anytime, you know where to find me.
Yeah.
Happy to come back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.